Closed captions available. To assist worshipers who may be hearing impaired, this worship service is closed captioned using Facebook's automatic captions. While these captions are imperfect, we hope they are of assistance to all who need them. If you wish to see the closed captions, you must turn them on. To do that, click on the cog icon below this image, and then turn on closed captions.
Let's see. Good morning to our audience in the pews and to our audience online. I know that this presentation is being recorded, so hopefully we can get it out to more members of our parish. I think it's an important presentation. What better way to celebrate Pride Month than to acknowledge the contributions of LGBTQ composers living in our time, but also to acknowledge the multidimensional identities of composers that are in the canon of Western music. Notably, there's some composers that will be referenced today in the presentation that are even represented today in our service music that might have just flown under the radar if we weren't, if we didn't have the benefit of our Assistant Director of Music's research today. So without further ado, I'll introduce Kristian Amundson, our Assistant Director of Music, and also pursuing his Master's Music, yes, in Composition at Catholic University. So I think we're in for a really enlightening presentation. Enjoy.
Good morning, everyone. Good to see you all. First, I would like to mention for everyone on our joining us virtually that this is merely an introduction to a brief 3-session class that we'll be doing throughout the month of July. Those are on Thursday evenings on July 7th, July 14th, and July 21st. On those dates, we'll dive more in depth into a lot of what we talk about here today, talk specifically more about the lives and stories of some of these composers, but also talk a bit more in depth about how their identity plays into how we interpret and how we listen to their music. Couple quick acknowledgments before we dive into this. As Heather mentioned, this is a presentation about composers within the Western European music canon. That is to say, sort of the Hall of Fame of European composers, which means that for the majority of this conversation, it will be focused around dead white men, as many musical conversations are bound to be, unfortunately, for a myriad of reasons, but that doesn't mean that there are not notable female composers that we'll talk about as part of this conversation as well. So, to begin, I would like to task you all with a simple, very, very simple homework assignment, and that is to go home today and do a quick Google search of your favorite composer. Mozart, Mendelssohn, Beethoven, Brahms, whoever. Most likely you will find that when you Google their name with maybe the keyword homosexuality or gay, you will find articles containing anywhere between rumors to somewhat substantiated proof that this composer was gay or bisexual. And this is the case for many composers, whether or not they actually were gay or not. Throughout much of European history, after the 1600s, there were laws in place that made being gay illegal, and many artists, composers, sculptors, painters were accused of these crimes by rivals, by upset patrons, by members of the community who found their art to be profane. Da Vinci was accused of being gay. There was very little evidence to support that at the time, and yet he stood trial, and it suffered a huge blow to his reputation. And we see that with some composers today. The composers I'm going to choose to focus on today, we have a larger body of evidence to suggest that they are gay. This means they either moved in societal circles that were associated with homosexuality or other sexual taboos, or we have their diaries, their letters, their personal journals that talked about their relationships. It's very important that we talk about this aspect of people's identity because for centuries, decades, it has been assumed that everyone is straight. And interpretations of these composers' music have based a lot of their assumptions on this core belief that everyone in the world is straight. Particularly when it comes to opera and ballet, where there are characters, often romantic, relationships expressed, people take the singular lens of heterosexuality and heteronormative ideals when analyzing them. And increasingly, as scholars learn more about the identities and sexualities of these composers, they learn that this probably isn't true, and that there's a lot more depth to these relationships that might be hidden under the surface. We're going to go today in chronological order, because it's the easiest way to organize a list of composers who range a wide, varied list of genres. But we'll start with the earliest known composers for whom we have valid evidence of being gay or homosexuality being part of their cultural zeitgeist. The first two composers I'll mention are George Friedrich Handel and Jean-Baptiste Lully, two composers from the Baroque and Renaissance periods respectively. And like many composers of this era, we don't have many primary sources to discuss their life in. What we do have is a lot of accounts of who their patrons were, who they had professional relationships with, who their engagement was with in terms of civic organizations. And for both Handel and Lully, their patrons were well-known patrons of gay artists. For Handel, he was the lucky recipient of a lot of support from a particular archbishop within the Catholic Church who supported countless gay artists that we have slightly better records of. But Handel was a very secretive person, or at least a very closed-off person. Despite the fact that he lived much of his life outside of Germany, he was always described as having sort of a German temperament, being very closed-off, very private person. This led to a lot of circulation of rumors. And unfortunately, this conversation that we'll have today involves a lot of rumors that have circulated. There is, of course, the rumor of the Bachelor, which circled around people like Copeland and around people like Benjamin Britten during their life, that they were a permanent bachelor. Of course, now we know that they both had longtime spouses that they lived with, just not recognized by any legal statute. Both Handel and Lully received patronage and moved in these social circles, and so we have a small amount of evidence to suggest this. Further analysis of Handel's oratorios, which are akin to religious operas, suggests that a lot of the relationships he was diving into in these, in a lot of his language, his word choice surrounding these relationships that he was talking about in his oratorios, was informed by his gay identity, or at least the identities of those that he would have regularly interacted with. Moving forward into what we generally refer to as the classical era, there are many composers here who we start to have personal journals, personal diaries and letters confirming relationships with people of the same sex and confirming their own struggles with the expectation of heterosexuality. The first major composer we're going to talk about today who has clear evidence that he was gay was Tchaikovsky, a Russian composer known best for his ballets Swan Lake, Beauty and the Beast. He is a well-known composer and in many respects the favored son of Russia. We'll talk a little bit later about how his identity has become sort of a political battleground, both in Russia and abroad, for discussing homophobic laws that have taken place in Eastern Europe and in Russia. But a lot of his music and a lot of the experiences of his contemporaries revolved around the unsuccessful or revoked revolutions of the 18th century. Towards the end of the 18th century, France's revolution leading to the French Republic and the 19th century unification of Germany changed a lot of the social paradigms and legal state of many countries. For instance, much of the lowlands of Germany, or what would become Germany, which were not under Prussian control, did not have laws at the time that prohibited homosexuality. It wasn't mentioned. It wasn't explicitly condoned or made legal, but there was no law on the book in many of these small countries that used to make up the Holy Roman Empire that expressly forbid homosexuality. But Prussia did, and Prussia had a lot of control when Germany reunified, so a unified Germany had many of the same Prussian laws regarding homosexuality, which affected many German composers like Wagner and their relationships with society, with culture. Similarly, the Russian invasion of Poland that very much affected Chopin's life also introduced to Poland the idea of laws banning homosexuality. Poland, since its creation in the 900s, had no law expressly mentioning homosexuality. Again, it wasn't condoned, it just wasn't mentioned. When Russia invaded and annexed Poland in the early 1800s, that changed, and Poland suddenly had these laws making homosexuality illegal. This large amount of change that happened in the 1800s is when we first start to see 18th and 19th centuries, is when we first start to see laws coming into place that target the gay community, that force them to live in a more secluded, more secretive life. In England, the first law on the books, passed by King Henry VIII, banned homosexuality in public. But in 1821, a law was passed that banned homosexuality in any relationship, at any age, in any place. This very much affected our next composer, Benjamin Britten. Benjamin Britten was born during World War I. Before World War I, he lived through a tumultuous time in British history, and he was the foremost British composer in many people's eyes, and he was the foremost gay British composer. He lived an open life, as much as an open life as one could live in a country where your lifestyle is illegal. He had long relationships with several men. But it wasn't until 1967, when he was 54 years old, that the legalization of homosexuality in private occurred in Britain. This change happened after Britten had pretty much stopped writing music. He was old, he was at the end of his career, he had sort of taken a pause to writing music. So pretty much all of his music is written at a time where his identity was at odds with the legal state, with the statutes of his society. A lot of his work deals with themes that attack the establishment. His most famous work, the War Requiem, includes the Latin text of the Requiem that we're all very familiar with, but it also includes these poems in English talking about the horrific acts that happen during war, that happen to the people who undergo war. While it's not necessarily anti-war rhetoric, it is unpatriotic in so many people's eyes. He faced backlash for not being a stern advocate of the war. And when we know what we know about Benjamin Britten and we look back at these parts of his identity, it's hard for us to ignore that he was a composer being asked to support a war by a country that would have sent him to prison for life if they knew who he was. Now, Britten luckily curried favor with people in power, so he was allowed to live a somewhat open, non-closeted life, but nonetheless, he was always under threat. He was always very secretive with who he was. He was always very slow to trust, and he was always very aware of the precipice that he stood on. The second British composer we're going to talk about, and the first female composer we're going to talk about today, lived a little earlier. Her name was Dame Ethel Smith. She is most famous as an activist for the women's suffrage movement in England, and she is a outstanding and inspirational figure who also wrote a fairly good amount of music in her life. And what's interesting about Dame Ethel Smith is that she was an open lesbian at a time where it was illegal for men to be gay, but in the UK and England, there were no laws expressly criminalizing lesbian relationships. And this brings us to a long history of the purposeful ignorance of female relationships. When we talk about Jewish law and bans on homosexuality within Jewish law, it is almost entirely framed as between two men. The same goes for all the laws up to this point. In Germany, in France, in England, in Italy, in Belgium, all of these laws that talked about homosexuality all framed them solely as a relationship between two men. In the 1920s, Parliament began to discuss creating a law that would make the relationship between two women illegal. In a very, very strange twist of fate, this law never came to be, partially because the House of Lords and the Church of England spoke out against this law. Now, that wasn't because they were huge, progressive, liberal icons for the gay community, but rather they thought that a law that made lesbianism illegal would only serve to bring what they thought to be a small niche group into the public eye. They thought that a law banning same-sex relationships between women would only serve to make women curious about these relationships. And so in a weird double-blind twist of ignorance and arrogance, they somehow managed to never criminalize what people like Dame Ethel Smith had done for decades, which is to live an open same-sex homosexual life between two women. And that brings us to this idea of identity as a political battleground. In the 1900s, the conversation began to start about gay rights, about gay advocacy, about rights surrounding adoption, rights surrounding marriage. And this is where we start to see individual composers and their identities become battlegrounds, become these places where we can fight over identity. We talked earlier about Tchaikovsky, who we have many letters saying that he was gay. We have letters to his lovers. We have his personal diary in which we know this. And pretty much every scholar outside of Russia would confirm it. They would say it's almost ludicrous to say otherwise. But in Russia, government-controlled censors have banned all mention of his sexuality. Government funds have gone towards making biopics of Tchaikovsky, which have centered around his rumored relationships with women, ignoring completely his long relationships with men. And this is a common trend, both in Russia, where we see homophobic laws taking place, and in Poland, where we see homophobic laws on the books for decades. Chopin is the Shakespeare of Poland. He is their favored son. And rumors about his sexuality have circulated for a long time. He has letters to one of his best friends, Titus, where he talks about his sexual desires. And yet, the Polish government refuses to acknowledge it at all and is the firmest advocate against his sexuality. And this is not just something that we see take place in Eastern Europe, but it's something that has happened in America to some of our best composers and most well-known composers. Aaron Copeland, who wrote pieces that everyone is familiar with, from Appalachian Spring to Billy the Kid to the music for the movie Grapes of Wrath. Prodigious amount of music, and is known for creating the American sound in music, creating what is genuinely the first fully American music. However, prior to a fateful vacation in Mexico, he had been well entrenched in the European ideals of music. And it wasn't until a vacation with his boyfriend and later lifelong partner, Victor Kraft, to Mexico that he found his new trajectory. Yet, in the stories of Copeland's life, the fact that this big change in his music happened during a 5-month vacation with his boyfriend seems to slip through the cracks. It's not mentioned. It's referred to as a work trip, a 5-month-long work trip to the beaches of Mexico, to Acapulco, to other well-known honeymoon spots between two men, where Copeland so happened to write some music. This is true also for composers later, like Leonard Bernstein and John Cage, who had relationships with other well-known composers, other well-known musical collaborators, yet their identity was either ignored or, in the case of Cage and Copeland, was used as a trigger to attack them. Both Copeland and Cage were chosen as targets during the era we now know as McCarthyism. They were hauled in front of Senate committees to talk about their relationship to the Communist Party, and this is partially because they had some relationship with the Communist Party, but more importantly because they both represented social outgroups, groups that were not accepted by society. They were gay men. In Copeland's case, they were gay Jewish men from New York that sat outside of the context of normal American identity. They were seen as anti-American. They were seen as anti-capitalist. And they were pursued and prosecuted as such. It's because of these composers, though, that we start to see an emergence of appreciation for gay composers and for their identity. In the 1900s, we start to see the first composers openly living as gay people. Famous composers Samuel Barber and Giancarlo Menotti, who for Grace People wrote A Mall of the Night Visitors, an operetta we've done here before, they were lifelong partners. They lived together at a house north of New York, and for decades, they were partners in everything. They composed together, they lived together, they were socially mobile together. Yet that part of their legacy is ignored. But composers living after them were able to center their identity. Modern composers like Pauline Oliveros and her wife Ione were able to center their identity in their work, to make ideas of interracial relationships, to make ideas of homosexual relationships, non-heteronormative ideals, trans ideals, part of their artwork explicitly. So, if I could revisit that homework assignment from earlier, where I had you Google your favorite composer and the word gay and see the rumors that spread, I'd now like you to, next time you're at a concert and there's a biography of a composer, give it a read and see if it has any mention whatsoever of his possible relationships with other men, of her lesbianism, of their trans identities. For many composers, we take that to mean that they were straight. But I would say that for a great many of them, this is not true, and the fact that we don't acknowledge it is a hindrance for our ability to understand, appreciate, and interpret their art. So, thank you all for your time, thank you all for listening, and thank you all for coming.